No, I never believed much in ghosts, said the doctor, but I was always rather afraid of them. Have you ever seen one? Asked one of the other men. The doctor took a cigar out of his mouth and contemplated the ash for a moment or two before replying. I've had some rather startling experiences. After a pause, during which the rest of us exchanged glances, for the doctor has seen many things and is not averse to talking about them in the congenial company. Would you care about hearing one of them? It gives me the cold shivers now to speak of it. We nodded, and the doctor, taking a sip as an antidote to the shivers, began. You remember George Carson, who played for the varsity some years ago? Big chap with a light mustache? Well, I saw a good deal of him before he married. While he was reading for a bar in town, it was just after he became engaged to Miss Stoner, who is now Miss Carson, that he asked me to go down to a place with his people had taken in the country. Miss Stoner was to be here, or there, and he wanted me to meet her. I could not go down for Christmas Day, as I promised to be with my people, but as I had been working a bit too hard and wanted a few days' rest, I decided to run down for a few days about the new year. Woodcote was a pleasant enough place to look at. There were more than 2 packs of hounds within easy distance, and it was not far enough from a station to cut you off completely from the morning papers. The Carsons have been lucky, I thought, in coming across such a good house at such a moderate figure, for as George told me, the owner had been obliged to go abroad for his health, and was anxious not to leave the place empty all winter. It was an old house, with big gables and preposterous corners all over the place, and you couldn't walk 10 paces along passengers without tumbling up or down the stairs. But it had been patched from time to time again, among other improvements. A big billiard room had been built out in the back. A country house in the winter without a billiard room when you go frost stops hunting is just, well, not even a gilded prison. The party is a small one. Besides George and his father and mother, there were only a couple of Mrs. Carson, who being somewhere in the early teens didn't count, and Miss Stoner, who of course counted a good deal, and lastly myself. Miss Stoner ought to be happy for George Carson. Besides being an excellent fellow all around, was by no means a bad match. Being an only son with considered expectations, but somehow or other, she did not strike me as looking either very well or very happy. She gave me the impression of having something on her mind, which made her alternatively nervous and listless. George, I fancied, noticed it, and was puzzled by it, for I caught him several times watching her with an anxious and inquiring look. But as I was not there as a doctor, of course, it was no business of mine, and I thought I discovered the reason before I left Woodcote. The second night of my arrival, we had been playing, I remember, a family pool. The rest had gone upstairs to bed. George and I adjourned to a sort of study, which he arranged upstairs. For a final smoke and a chat before tuning in, the study was next to his bedroom, and parted off from it by curtains. As we were settling down, I missed my pipe, and I remembered that I had laid it down in the billiard room. On principle, I never smoke another man's pipe, so I lit a candle, the house being in darkness, and started away in search of my own. The house looked awfully weird just by flickering light of a solitary candle, and the stairs creaked in a particularly gruesome way behind me, just for all the world as though someone were following my heels. I found my pipe, where I had expected, in the billiard room, and came back in perhaps a little more hurry than there was absolutely necessary. which perhaps explains why I stumbled in a certain light over a couple unforeseen stairs and dropped my candle. Of course, it went out, but after a little groping, I found it. Having no matches with me, I was slowly advanced, sliding my hand along the board at the slide, or side. It suddenly slid over something cold and clammy, which was not what I expected. Stopping dead and closing my fingers around for an instant, I felt that I was holding another hand, a skinny, bony hand, which writhed itself slowly from my grasp, and though I could hear nothing and see nothing, I was yet conscious that something was brushed past me and going up the stairs. Hi, what's that? Who are you? I called. There was no answer. I admit I was in a regular funk. I must have shown it in my face. What's the matter? Asked George, as I blundered slowly into his study. Oh, nothing, I answered, dropping my candle in lost way. Who were you talking to? I was only swearing at the candle, I replied. Oh, I thought perhaps you had seen somebody, replied George. Somehow I did not like to tell him the truth, for fear he'd laugh at my nervousness. But I, determined to keep an eye on my liver and take a couple weeks' complete rest, the night I woke up several times with the feeling of that confounded hand under my own, a clammy hand which writhed as my fingers closed upon it. The next morning after breakfast, I was in the billiard room practicing strokes, while Carson was over at the stables. Presently, the door opened, and Miss Stoner looked in. Come in, I said. George will be back from the stables in a few minutes. Meanwhile, we can have 50 up. I wanted to speak to you, she said. She was looking very tired and ill, and I began to think I should not have interrupted holiday after all. Do you believe in ghosts? She asked, having closed the door and come up to the table, where she stood leaning with both her arms upon it. No, I replied, missing an easy carom as I remembered my experience of last night, but I believe in fancy. And supposing that a person fancied he saw things, is there any remedy? What do you mean, Miss Stoner? I replied, looking at her in some surprise. Do you mean that you fancy... I stopped. For Miss Stoner turned away, sat down, one way of the easy chairs by the wall, and burst into tears. Oh, please let me help you. I believe I'm going mad. I laid down my cue and went over to her. Look here, Miss Stoner, I said, taking her hand, which was hot and feverish. I am a doctor, and I am a friend of George. Now tell me all about it, and I'll do my best to set it right. She was in a more or less hysterical condition, and her words were more freely punctuated by sobs. But gradually I managed to elicit her from nearly every night since she came to Woodcote. She had been awakened in some mysterious way, and had seen a horrible face looking at her from top of a screen which stood by the door of her bedroom. As soon as she moved, the face disappeared, which convinced her that the apparition existed only in her imagination. That seemed to distress her even more than if she had believed to be a genuine ghost, for she thought her brain was giving away. I told her that she was only suffering from a very common symptom of a nervous disorder, as indeed it was, and promised to send a groom into a village to get a prescription made up for her. And, having made promise to breathe no word to anyone of the subject, more especially George, she went away relieved. Nevertheless, I was not quite certain that I had made a correct diagnosis for the case. You see, I had been rather upset myself not many hours before. George was no longer than I expected at the stable, and I was just going to find him when at the door, I met Miss Carson. "Can you spare me one moment?" she said, as I held the door open for her. "I wanted to find you alone." "Certainly, Miss Carson, with pleasure. An hour, if you wish," I replied. "It is so convenient, you know, to have a doctor in the house," she said, with a nervous laugh. "Now, I want you to prescribe me a sleeping draught. My nerves are rather out of order, and I don't sleep as much as I should." "Ah, I see it. Do you see faces and such like things when you are awake?" "How do you know?" she asked quickly. "Oh, I inferred from the other symptoms. We doctors have to observe all kinds of little things." "Well, of course, I know it is only fancy, but it is just as bad as if it were real. I assume you are making me quite ill, and I didn't think to mention it to Carson or to George. They would think I was losing my head." I gave Mrs. Carson the same prescription as I had written for Miss Stoner, though by that time conviction had grown upon me that there was something wrong, which could not be cured by medicine. However, I decided to say nothing to George about the matter at present, for I could hardly utilize the confidence which had been placed in me by Miss Stoner and Miss Carson. My own experience of the night before would scarcely have appeared convincing to him, but I determined that on the next day, which was Sunday, I would invent an excuse for staying at home from church and make some explorations in the house. There was obviously some mystery at work which wanted clearing up. We all sat up rather late that night. They seemed to be in general disinclination to go to bed. We stayed all together in the billiard room until nearly midnight, and then loitered about in the hall, talking in an aimless sort of fashion. But at last, Mrs. Carson said good night, with a confidential nod to me, and Miss Stoner murmured, "So many things. I've got it." And they both went upstairs. George and I parted in the corridor above. Our rooms were opposite to each other. I did not begin undressing at once, but I sat down and tried to piece together some theory about account for the uncanniness of things. But the more I thought, the more perplexing it became. There was no doubt whatever that I put my hand on something extremely alive and extremely unpleasant the night before. The bare recollection of it made me shudder. What living thing could possibly be creeping about the house in the dark? It was a man's hand. Of that I was certain from the size of it. George Carson was out of the question, for he was in his room all the time. Nor was it likely that Miss Carson, Sr., was still about his house in socks and refused to answer when spoken to. The only other man in the house was an eminently respectable-looking butler, and his hands, as I noted particularly when he poured out my wine at dinner, was plump and soft, whereas the mysterious hand in the balustrade was thin and bony. And then, what was the real explanation of the face which had appeared to the two ladies? Indigestion might have been explained either singly. Extraordinary coincidences do sometimes occur, but it seemed too extraordinary for a couple of ladies, one old and young, should suffer from the same indigestion in the same house, at the same time, and with the same symptoms. On the whole, I did not feel at all comfortable, and looked carefully in all the cupboards and recesses, as well as under the bed, before starting to undress. Then I went to the door, intending to lock it. Just as my hand was upon the key, I heard a soft step in the corridor outside, accompanied by a sound which was something between a sigh and a groan. Very faint, but quite unmistakable. And under the circumstances, discomposing, it might of course be George. Anyhow, I decided to look and see. I turned the handle gently and opened the door. There was nothing to be seen in the corridor, but on the opposite side I could see a door open, and George's head peeping around the corner. "Hello?" I said. "Hello," I replied. "Was that you walking up the passage?" he said. "No," I answered. "I thought it might be you." "Then who the devil was it?" he said. "I swear I heard someone." There was a silence for a few moments. I was wondering whether I had better tell him of the fright I had already, when he spoke again. "I say, just come here for a bit, old fellow. I want to speak to you." I stepped across the passage and we went together into the little study which adjoined his bedroom. "Look here," he said, poking up at the fire, which was burning low. "Doesn't it strike you that there is something very odd about this house?" "You mean..." "Well, I wouldn't say anything about it to the master or Mrs. Stoner for fearing or frightening them. All the same, scarcely a night passes but I hear curious footsteps on the stairs. You've heard them yourself, haven't you?" "Now you mention it," I said, "I confess, I have. And what is more," he continued, "I was sitting here 2.5 nights ago, and it seems ridiculous, I know, but it's a fact. I suddenly saw a horrible face glaring at me from between those curtains behind you. It was gone in a moment, but I saw it as plainly as I see you." I moved my seat uneasily. "Did you look in your bedroom or the passage?" I asked. "Yes, at once," he replied. "There was nothing to be seen, but twice again that night I heard footsteps passing." "Good God!" He started up from his chair, staring straight over my shoulder. I turned quickly and saw the curtains which parted the bedroom swings together. "What is it?" I asked breathlessly. I saw it again. The same face between the curtains. I tore the hangings aside and rushed into the next room. It was empty. The lamp was burning upon the side table. The door was open, just as George had left it. In the passage outside was all quiet. I came back into the study and found George running his fingers through his hair perplexedly. "There is clearly one person too many in this house," I said. "I think we ought to draw the place and find out who it is." "All right," he said, picking up the poker from the fireplace. "If it's anything made of flesh and blood, this will be useful. And if not..." He stopped short, for at that instant the most awful shriek of horror rang through the house, a shriek of wild, uncontrollable terror, such as I had never heard something before, and I never hoped to hear again. One moment we stood staring at each other, dumbfounded. The next, George Carson had dashed out the room and down the corridor to the stairs. I followed close behind him, for we both knew that none but a woman in mortal fear would shriek like that, and that woman was Miss Stoner. Down the stairs we tumbled, pell-mell in the darkness. But before I reached the landing below, where Miss Stoner's room was, I felt as if I had something from the evening before. Something brushed swiftly past me. As I ran, I turned and caught it at the dark, but my hand gripped only empty air. I was just about to turn back and follow it when a cry from George arrested me, and, looking down, I saw him standing over the prostrate from Miss Stoner. The door of her room was open, and by the moonlight which streamed into the room, I could see her lying in a white nightdress across the threshold. What followed in the next few minutes I can scarcely recall with accuracy. The whole house was aroused by the poor girl's awful shriek. She was quite unconscious when we had came upon her, but she revived more or less as soon as Miss Carson and the other terrified servants had lifted her head into bed again. Nothing unintelligible could be gathered from her. However, as the cause of her fright, she only repeated hysterically, again and again, "Oh, the face! The face!" When I saw her, I could do no further good for the present. I took George by the arm and led him out of the room. "Look, George," I said, "we must find out the reason of this at once. I am certain I felt something go by me as I came downstairs. Now, does that staircase lead anywhere but to our rooms?" George considered for a moment. "Yes," he replied. "There is a door at the end of the passage which leads up to a sort of lumber room." "Then we'll explore it," I said. "For my part, I can't go sleep until we figure out what's causing this. Get the man to bring a lantern along." The butler looked as though he didn't half like the enterprise, and, to tell the truth, no more did I. I was the uncanniest job I ever took. However, we started. The three of us, first of all, we searched the rooms on the floor above where George and I slept. Everything was just as we had left it. Then I pushed open the door at the end of the corridor. A crazy-looking staircase led into the darkness. We went cautiously up. I first with the candle, then George, and last, all the butler with the lantern. At the top we stepped into a big, rather low room, with beams across the ceiling and a rough, uneven floor. Our lights threw strange shadows into the corners, and more than once, I stared at what looked like to be a crouching human figure. We searched every corner. There was nothing to be seen but a few old boxes, a roll or two of matting, and some broken chairs. But in the far corner, George pointed out to me a rickety ladder which ended up being a closet trap door. Just when I distinctly heard the curious, half-groaning, half-sighing sound which had already puzzled me in the corridor below. We stood still and looked at one another. We all heard the sound. "Whatever it is, it's up there," I said. "The question is, who's going up?" George put his candle down upon the floor and stepped upon the ladder. It cracked beneath his weight. He stopped. "Come down. It won't bear you," I said. "I shall have to go." I don't know that I was ever in such a queer funk as I was while I slowly mounted the ladder and pushed open the trap door. I had formed no clear idea of what to expect to find here. Certainly I was not prepared for what happened, for no sooner was the trapdoor fully open and there literally fell upon me from the darkness above a thing in a human shape, which kicked and spat and tore at me as I stood clinging up to the ladder. It lasted but for a moment or so, but in that moment I lived a lifetime of terror. The ladder swayed and cracked beneath me, and I fell on the floor. With this feeling gripping my throat like a vice. The next instant George just stunned it with a blow from the poker and dragged it off of me. It lay upon its back on the floor, a ragged, hideous, loathsome shape. and the mystery was solved. But you hadn't told us what it really was, said the listeners. The doctor smiled. It was the owner of the house, he replied. He had not gone abroad. He had gone to a private lunatic asylum with homicidal mania upon him. About a fortnight before, and he had managed to escape. And having made his way to his former home, he concealed himself. With the cunning often shown by lunatics in the loft, I supposed he had found enough to eat in his nightly rambles about the house. The only wonder is that he didn't kill someone before the night was gone. Sorry. Let me do that one more time. Sorry, it's the end of the story. So sorry. The only wonder is that he didn't kill someone before he was caught.